report on the military involvement of the Department of Energy. And it's so extensive, it's the major operation that goes on there.
There have been over 5,000 patents that have been sequestered by the national security state, taken out of the public domain. Many of them deal with energy technologies.
It's a policy that the military seems to feel is necessary for national security. However, at this point, we often wonder, 50 years after World War II and the Cold War, whether such sequestering is necessary.
Suppression of new technology would be an obvious plague on the idea and strength of a free market system. Yet, it still seems to happen right in front of our eyes.
And this is a huge controversy, one of the largest, maybe most intense controversies in the history of science. There's nothing worse, I found, than suggesting to academic physicists in particular, and academics in general, that they are not only wrong, but disastrously wrong, catastrophically wrong. Cold fusion patents have not been approved. They will not get through. American citizens are being denied their constitutional rights. I inadvertently was looking through some piles of paper that had been given to me in a casual manner by all these hot fusion physicists as they were trying to do their calorimetric repeat of the Pons-Fleischmann experiment. And I was stunned. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It looked like monkey business to me at the time, and it has turned out to be exactly that. It was represented as a negative result when it was positive. And that data is scientific fraud, as far as I'm concerned. It's been referred to legal authorities in the government. I asked for a review at MIT, got nowhere. If this type of manipulation had occurred in any legitimate research area, such as cancer research, AIDS research, global warming research, anything that's accepted as reasonable to be researching, the people would lose their jobs, they wouldn't be in science. And yet, these people today, their data is used today, to year 2000, and all before, to reject patents. Yes, there is serious criminal activity going on that ultimately must be rooted out.
It became very clear to me that, you know, you kind of had a tiger by the tail here, and that this was serious.
For a moment, Dr. Greer considered shutting everything down. He had been threatened and swindled far too many times. Sherry was gone. He had no office, no staff, no money.
Back in 1998, I was given information by a friend that Dr. Greer was having a conference.
Literally the month that Sherry Adamek passed away, within 30 days, I have this scheduled event.
So I went to the conference and learned some things and listened.
And so she just on a lark came, and she's an emergency doctor like I am.
And what really grabbed my attention was he was getting all this information from military witnesses.
That was in 1998. By 2000, when we were planning and storyboarding and working the whole disclosure project event out and pulling together all these hundreds of witnesses, we didn't really have the funding to do it. But she got so supportive and involved that she lived very modestly and took all of her excess income and donated it.
And I want to acknowledge some amazing people that are here. Dr. Jan Bravo, without whom we would not have the Disclosure Project.
But it's not just the funding she's provided, it's the moral support and the encouragement and the friendship. And so she's just become a very key person. And, you know, it's sort of metaphysical and odd that literally the month that Sherry Adamek passed away, within 30 days, I have this scheduled event.
Not alone anymore. With the support of a loyal team, Dr. Greer grew his witness list from a couple dozen to over 200.
And see that little, the little dot right there? That dot don't belong there.
said, I'm one of those what you would call the high government officials in the FAA. I was the division chief. There was only 3 or 4 down from the admiral.
I was awarded the Air Force Guided Missile Insignia. I was the first photographic officer in the Air Force to get they called it the missile badge.
So I forgot who it was that called, but he says, we got a problem here. What's the problem? He says, well, it's that UFO.
We weren't launching real nuclear weapons, we were launching dummy warheads. They were the exact size, shape, and dimension and weight. And we were looking down southwest, and the missile popped up through the fog. It was just beautiful. And I hollered, there it is. And our guys on our M45 tracking mount with 180-inch lenses on it got it. We sent the film back down to Vandenberg.
The Japanese airline, 747, was coming from the northwest, going across the Alaskan territory. He called and asked the controller if the controller had any traffic at his altitude. His radar is picking up a target. He sees this target with his eye, and the target, the way he described it, a huge ball with lights running around it, and I think he said it was like 4 times as big as a 747.
I was called into Major Mansman's office at the 1st Strategic Aerospace Division headquarters. And Major Mansman said, watch this. There was the launch from a day or 2 before it at Big Sur. We watched that stage burn out, we watched the 2nd stage burn out, we watched the 3rd stage burn out, and it's going like this. And into the frame came something else. It flew into the frame like this, and it shot a beam of light at the warhead, fires another beam of light, goes around like this, we're going like this, fires another beam of light, goes down like this, fires another beam of light, and then flies out the way it came in. And the warhead tumbles out of space.
They brought in 3 people from the FBI, 3 people from the CIA, and 3 people from Reagan's scientific study team, and I don't know who the rest of the people were. When they got done, they actually swore all these other guys into that this never took place.
Who said that? Who was saying?
This was one of the guys from the CIA.
Now, I saw that. I don't give a goddamn what anybody else says about it. I saw that on film. Phil Klass can kiss my ass. He wasn't there. I was.
He said this is the first time they ever had 30 minutes of radar data on a UFO.
He said, you are never to speak of this again. As far as you're concerned, this never happened. So I said, yes, sir, and walked out, and that was the last I talked about it for 18 years.
The original video that I took, and I had the pilot's report, and I had the FAA's first report that was all downstairs on my table. They didn't ask for that, so I didn't give it to them.
There are things that I know about that I did in the service that I won't talk about to you now because they're top secret, and I could get my ass in trouble for talking about them. If you parse what Major Mansman said, he said, you are to say, this never happened. Well, that's not classifying it top secret, is it? And I was a part of a United States Air Force cover-up for 18 years.
But who do you tell that you were involved in a UFO incident without them looking at you like you ain't wrapped too tight?
What we photographed up there affected me for the rest of my life and made a huge impact on my understanding of the universe and of governmental manipulation of our minds.
Now, with the witnesses on his side, Dr. Greer had the firepower to attack Washington again.
We are not alone. That's the message a group of pilots, scientists, and former government officials want Congress to hear.
21 members of that group already have testified in Washington for what's known as the Disclosure Project.
And we had all volunteers who organized that whole event. And there was no paid staff. So when people look at that whole period, we didn't have an office, a secretary, and one paid staff person. But we did it.
Dr. Stephen Greer heads up the Disclosure Project, a group that compiles information from people who say they've encountered extraterrestrial forms of life.
20 years ago, in 1980, I was a security specialist assigned to RAF Bentwaters. Objects made incursions over our WSA, fired pencil-thin beams of light into them, and adversely affected the ordnance, possibly.
There were bodies that were involved with some of these crashes, also some were alive.
What do members plan to do with their information? They hope Congress and President Bush take notice.
We are asking for the U.S. Congress and for President Bush to move towards an official inquiry and disclosure on this subject.
Those that don't want to believe you will never believe you anyway, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't change the truth.
A spokesperson for the Senate Science, Technology, and Space Committee says no congressional hearings are planned right now. Elaine Quijano, CNN Headline News.
I stand before you today in my almighty God, and I tell you this. If Congress calls me in and says, will you testify in detail what you know, I stand here today prepared and ready to do just that. Governments must never lie to the people. Thank you.
The number of people Dr. Greer had managed to get behind him was monumental. In a perfect world, an event of this proportion, with that amount of coverage, would have been enough to start a legitimate movement. But of course, we hardly live in a perfect world.
Yeah, don't say it. It's on. You know it, right? I don't know, guy. Everything's fucked up.
9/11 became the mother of all news stories and completely changed the game for everyone.
Fear, panic, and strife were imprinted in the public consciousness. To what end? Not to go after Al-Qaeda, but rather to invade the sovereign nation of Iraq. Given such a drastically overt misstep on the part of a U.S. government led by an oil family, the question on some people's minds is whether or not this disaster was exploited, or worse, engineered. The Gulf of Tonkin in the Vietnam War, Chiang Kai-shek in the Korean War. False flag operations are nothing new. However, according to some, the ultimate card to play might be yet to come.
How do you grow the trillion-dollar military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about into a $2 or $3 trillion program? You got to have a bigger enemy out there.
Von Braun's purpose in life during the last years of his life, his dying years, was to educate the public and decision makers about space-based weapons. First, the Russians were the enemy against whom we're going to build space-based weapons. Then terrorists would be identified, and that was soon to follow. In 1977, I was at a meeting in Fairchild Industries, and in that room were a lot of charts on the walls with enemies, identified enemies, names that people had never heard of, names like Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi. But we were talking then about terrorists, the potential terrorists. No one had ever talked about this before. And they continued the conversation about how they were going to antagonize these enemies, and that at some point there was going to be a war in the Gulf.
According to these theorists, after the military-industrial complex had its war against terrorism, the next enemy that Dr. von Braun identified on Earth would be third world country fanatics. But with no more enemies left, the people would soon be taught to look to space.
The next enemy was asteroids. Now at this point, he kind of chuckled the first time he said it. Asteroids, against asteroids we're going to build space-based weapons. So it was funny then. And the funniest one of all was against what he called aliens, extraterrestrials. That would be the final card. And over and over and over during the 4 years that I knew him and was giving his speeches for him, he would bring up that last card. And remember, Carol, all of it is a lie.
99% of all the information out in the public on this subject is well-crafted disinformation designed to scare people to support the next phase in global warfare. And this kind of corruption is why the only things that are being made on this subject are things that redound to paranoia and fear in the military-industrial complex.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
I don't think we're moving forward if we trade, factional and ideological war from one ethnic or religious or economic system into an interplanetary conflict, because that's A, not survivable, and B, would be even worse in terms of galvanizing the world around a military structure. That has been the central organizing principle of our society for a few thousand years, actually.
It is hard to concretely prove that 9/11 was a false flag attack because the people behind it are so good at covering their tracks, especially with the compliance of mainstream media. If you had trillions of dollars, you'd be pretty good at it too.
The adversary is closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy. According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. $2.3 trillion in transactions.
According to the Comptroller General of the United States, there are serious financial management problems at the Pentagon. Fiscal year 1999, 2.3 trillion missing. Fiscal year 2000, 1.1 trillion missing. And DOD is the #1 reason why the government can't balance its checkbook. I would like for you to respond to the questions that I've put to you today.
I've forgotten what the second question was.
How does one carve out a billion unacknowledged or 10 billion unacknowledged taxpayer dollars? In many cases, at the end of a fiscal year, when there is so-called leftover money, they may or may not know that money may in fact go to a special access program.
There are two main types of special access programs: acknowledged and unacknowledged, or USAPs.
Those programs are basically totally off the books, and they are able to actually vacuum up money to be a self-perpetuating funding mechanism.
Certain USAPs are waived and also completely managed and controlled by private contractors, so they enjoy the secrecy protections only afforded to private corporations. There is virtually no high-level government oversight for these types of USAPs. In many cases, no elected official, including even the president, have knowledge a particular USAP even exists. Between 1947 and 1949, the government passed the National Security Act and the CIA Act. These laws allowed the intelligence community to withdraw money from any agency without disclosure. Essentially, money could be stolen from any program, and no elected official would ever know about it.
Great view of the eye socket. Very different eye socket from, that's another thing that the scientists who've looked at this at Stanford have commented on. If you look at this creature and you look at the cranial vault, how large it is, the size from the eyes up is at least 3 times that of a human.
One of the first things that Dr. Lockman immediately remarked upon was the shape of the head and the skull. It was not something that he is accustomed to seeing, and it was quite interesting and in some ways exciting that the associated features that you would expect from a syndrome of that nature were not found. This specimen does not fall under any known, to me, class of disorders or syndromes. In many respects, the proportions of the spine and extremities are normal. The major abnormalities appear to be: 1, the size of the specimen, mid-face hypoplasia and underdevelopment of the jaw, and that the specimen has only 10 ribs. Humans normally have 12, rarely 11. One of the most remarkable aspects of this is when we came down to study the actual bone density. One of the features of fetuses that specialists looks at is the so-called growth plates of the epiphyseal joint, say, of the knees. The shock, I think, and the surprise was, and the absolute certainty that Dr. Lockman had, was that this specimen is between the age of 6 to 8 years old. The shock was that this specimen was clearly not fetal. How do you explain how something 6 inches tall survived to any length of time that would allow for it to survive 100 or 1,000 years ago?
And what amazes me is the media. Well, they're so compromised on this, they don't dare do anything but follow the company line on it. The company line being a series of lies.
This is a document talking about the current program at the CIA. And it says that the PAO, Public Affairs Office, has relationships with reporters from every underlying major wire service, newspaper, news weekly, and television network in the nation. In many instances, we have persuaded reporters to postpone, change, hold, or even scrap stories that could have adversely affected national security. Now, what's the purpose of this? The CIA has no mandate for anything domestic. The FBI is domestic. What the hell is this?
Where are we now? We are in a bread and circus. This is a phrase used to describe the creation of public approval, not through excellent public policy, but rather through diversion and distraction.
No, I'm not doing that. I'm sorry. You are driving me nuts. That's ridiculous.
Keep people fat, keep them happy, keep them diverted, and keep them entertained with drivel and shock and nonsense. That's, unfortunately, the sort of thing that has taken the place of news and information.
So that what we're seeing today is a world in which perception is being managed by as little as 5 major media corporations who collectively control magazines, newspapers, corporate news websites, television stations, movies, documentaries.
Who are these people? Who could be behind the curtain? Who could possibly be controlling us so effectively?
A shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself.
Majestic 12 is real. Notorious MJ-12, which is no longer called MJ-12. I'm trying to find out the new name. Basically, it's an oversight group intermingled with the National Security Council and the National Security Planning Group. They have full control. They have no congressional oversight whatsoever. They answer to nobody.
Whatever activity is going on, to the extent that it is a clandestine group, a quasi-government group, a quasi-private group, it is without any type, as far as I can tell, of high-level government oversight. And that is a great concern.
Ladies and gentlemen, the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And there is very grave danger, for we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections. Its preparations are concealed, not published, Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
It's got too much tissue on it. They actually want a piece of the bone from at least like a 0.5 of a millimeter in.
Como medio milímetro de...
We took material from inside the cranium, also 2 clippings of the anterior front ribs of this being. And we were able to see under the dissecting microscope that in fact it did have bone marrow in them, so that meant there should be some good genetic material in there.
It was really nerve-wracking. Imagine, 2 big guys here trying to operate on this 13-centimeter long beam. But we did it.
The DNA analysis is being done by some of the world's best, but even the world's best need to be cross-checked, which is why I'm doing the 3 different facilities. So I actually ran 4 samples. I ran a sample of my own blood, a very small amount, just 100 microliters. I ran 2 blanks, things that just had water in them, because that would be essentially a contamination control. And then, of course, the sample itself. And really, the all-important first result was whether or not there was, in fact, any DNA which was isolated. And the actual shock for me was when I got the amount of DNA out of this sample. It was way above what I had originally expected. What you have on the left here is a so-called DNA ladder. This is a size standard. This one on the end is, in fact, my DNA, and it has an expected size distribution as well as some banding. And validating the original measurement is this analysis that basically shows that we have a nice distribution for the sample's DNA.
When we physicists look for alien civilizations, we don't look for little green men. We look for energy consumption. We look for type 1, type 2, and type 3 civilizations. What are we? We are type 0. We get our energy from dead plants, oil and coal. Around the year 2100, we will become a type 1 civilization. And we see the beginnings of that now. What is the internet? The internet is a type 1 telephone system.
Imagine, if you will, sitting down to your morning coffee, turning on your home computer to read the day's newspaper. Well, it's not as far-fetched as it may seem.
Information has largely been controlled in a top-down way. What we're seeing now is the dissemination of discoveries coming up from the grassroots and not from a top-down centralized authority which has the ability to say, this isn't making it because we don't believe it's true. This is making it because it fits the mainstream.
When we want to form a new team in a new country, then all we have to do is contact someone there using the internet, and suddenly they're a member of the node.
From this online collective seems to come a real communion. People from all over gather in groups to investigate UFOs, with safety in numbers against ridicule and disinformation.
What we found in the past is we had a lot of anecdotal stories, but we didn't have a whole lot of data. With the advent of computers, personal computers, and the internet, we've been able to collect the data and analyze it through some 200 plus data points to allow us to be able to compare cases and to see exactly what's happening and what the trends are.
Nick Pope is our guest. He made this information public. He's also the former head of the Ministry of Defense's UFO project. So if anybody knows, we think it's you, Nick.
The Ministry of Defense is in the process of declassifying and releasing its entire archive of UFO files going back decades.
It's interesting and worth pointing out that while the British government is releasing their files and their documents, President Obama, who promised to do the same during the campaign, he still has not.
15 years.
15 years this spring.
My God. But I figured that, you know, after the disclosure project, we'd get this information out and we could go on with life.
How do we keep battering the ram at this door? Where do we find the strength to keep going forward? When you think that you're the only person that has the knowledge, you become marginalized. Steve was instrumental in bringing together a large group who had been involved in this subject and who for the first time realized that they were not alone in trying to come forward on the subject.
Governments, we've discovered, have not gone far enough, so we've decided that as people, using the CE5 protocols, form our own movement and do what governments have not been doing. We think of this as the People's Disclosure Movement.
And so we feel it's important to create an effort that's a global effort, which this has become.
My name is Mark Benz, and this is Rex, and we're in Bodega, California, and we're doing CE5.
My name is Jeff Bird, and here in Winchester, Virginia, USA, we are doing CE5.
My name is Peggy Brewster, and here in Middleton, United States of America, we are doing CE5.
We have 1,150 teams of CE5 ambassadors, which are spread over 52 countries.
My name is Andre, and here in Sweden, we are doing CE5.
Und wir machen zusammen CE5 in Deutschland.
Here in Burlington, Ontario.
Brisbane, Australia.
From Chester, Virginia.
In Hamilton, Ohio.
We are doing the CE5.
Konnichiwa.
Moje ime Daniel.
Donia tu na Slovensku.
Es Leo Ortiz.
And here in Vancouver, British Columbia.
Present to CSA.
In CE5. The CE5 context mas.
CE5.
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 We're doing CE5.
And the reason I think that's so important is that it not only builds the knowledge base, but it also further potentiates this concept of pioneering a new pattern of peaceful contact. And that is something that no other group, large group on Earth is doing. Certainly isn't being done by the State Department and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
It seems to be it only takes one person to make contact. But hundreds of voices worldwide is a call that can't be missed. And likewise with innovation, the more heads in the game, the more likely we are to find a solution.
There's many technologies that people have talked about, many ways to the mountaintop.
We have so many modes of converting quantum vacuum energy or zero-point energy.
Some people think they know how to do it. Okay, fine. But if you do it theoretically, that's one thing. But then you got to do it experimentally, and that's the hard part.
Those opposed to new energy technologies can tie the hands of hundreds of inventors. But how will they ever fare against tens of thousands?
The output milliamperage is more than the input milliamperage. It's a clear indicator of overunity.
I'm gonna ask you to look away. I love my hands, but it hurts to pray. The life I have isn't what I'd seen. The sky's not blue and the field's not green. Wait for me. Wait for me. Wait for me. Wait
When you oscillate or vibrate magnetic fields, there's an effect in the gravity field. And how to do that linkage is what you're trying to get at, as I understand
Maxwell's equations are in that term right there. And what happens is if you're going to have a gravitational effect, it's going to happen over there.
Josh, I think I can help too. This channel here represents revolutions per minute. These are representing weight that we're measuring on the load cells. Full steam ahead.
When we look at our data, we lost 7% of weight. If we move this thing and it loses weight, I must be generating gravity waves.
Though the device maintains its shape and size in terms of dimension, it is losing mass. That's a possibility. If it is losing mass, then certainly it would also be affecting time in a very localized manner.
By looking at new technology, you could break through new commercial aspects to improve our society.
We should be looking for a disruptive breakthrough in this technology within the next 10 years. We're on the brink of developing any number of potential propulsion systems which would take us out of the solar system. I think we're going to beat NASA to the mark.
So I graduated from the UCLA School of Engineering in 1976. I got a flyer from the School of Engineering inviting me to a lecture by Ben Rich.
Ben Rich was the director of Lockheed's Skunk Works for 16 years. He oversaw a number of USAPs that were secretly managed at the Skunk Works, including, most notably, the development of the F-117 stealth fighter.
Ben shared a slide set of about 40 slides of different things, starting with the U-2 spy plane, going all the way up to the stealth fighter at that time, mentioning that he couldn't talk about the other secret stuff. But when he ended his talk, he had a slide of a black disc zipping off into outer space. And he ended his talk with these words: "We now have the technology to take ET home."
So you have to have vision, and you have to have the guts and the courage to go out past the steps and do something of any value, and we have to go past our grasp.
And we asked him questions about it. What did you mean when you said we have the technology to take ET home? Ben shared three major things that I think are worthy of research by researchers worldwide at this point in time. The first was we've somehow figured out how to do interstellar travel already. It's known. The second point he made was that there was an error in the equations. My suspicion is it's probably Maxwell's equations for electromagnetic theory. The third thing he said was, how does ESP work? And I was really kind of startled because I didn't know what to say. But I blurted out, I don't know, all points in time and space are connected. And he looked me back in the eye and he said, that's how it works.
History has taught us that to simply innovate new technology may not be enough. We have to find a way to get past the suppression.
We've already now had a breakthrough just a couple months ago of the tritium battery. Finally, a company has come up with an actual commercializable unit, but it's very small. It's designed for an IC or some small circuit component. So this is a good sign, because it shows the way to introduce a free energy device is to introduce a small version of it. If you have a revolutionary energy device, it has to be introduced in a way that doesn't look like it's a revolution.
Science is always changing. I mean, even back in the 1960s, they thought that biofeedback, for example, was impossible. But now, of course, we know that that itself is an absurd statement. We have even toys on the market that allow people to, play with biofeedback.
These sciences have been around for decades. They have been ruthlessly kept secret because of the kleptocracy of what I call the petrofascists, the people who are hell-bent on maintaining the power of a centralized petrodollar oil, gas, coal system. So that does create scarcity because that is a zero-sum game. But when you take us off that system onto this new system, it's an entirely new macroeconomic order, and scarcity becomes non-existent.
After years of disappointments, Dr. Greer and his team are now attempting to build an energy research lab in Virginia, where scientists and inventors with working prototypes will have a safe haven to build.
So this is an example of how the analysis is done using what's called a genome browser. And it's more or less a schematic representation of the chromosomes, and at a very high level of resolution. So the sequence that we got from the mitochondria tells us with extremely high confidence that the mother was an indigenous Indian from the Chilean area, and the haplotype is called B2A. Now, the other thing that immediately fell out of the analysis is that it's male. It has so-called Y chromosome material. In fact, it's got a full Y chromosome. It probably died in the last century, if I were to make a guess. I can say with absolute certainty that it is not a monkey, right? It is human, or as close to human, closer to human than chimpanzees would be. But when you count up the number of mutations that we're observing, what we're seeing is more than what we would expect to be caused by simple cell division. When the sequencer is creating or making these reads, it's doing it more or less at random. So what does the computer program do that people have written and designed? It takes every one of the little sequences and tries to match it against the known. And then anything that doesn't match, it puts in a little side file and says this is unknown. At a certain point, when enough knowns are matched, I can feel comfortable saying, this is human, right? But if I'm not careful and I don't pay attention to what's in the garbage can, right, what the computer program is throwing away, I could literally be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What we've done is we've scaled back, and we're seeing several chromosomes and pieces of chromosomes across the top, which basically leaves us with a very strange conundrum. Right, here you've got this 6-inch tall, let's call it human, right, because the DNA says that so far it's human, at least the way that we're looking at it. This gene, PCNT, which is known to be associated with primordial dwarfism, we don't have any mutations here. It lived to the age of 6 to 8. Obviously, it was breathing, it was eating, it was metabolizing, and it wasn't living in an environment where there was a lot of advanced medical attention that was given to it to allow it to live to that age. It calls into question how big the thing might have been when it was born. So genetically, you might explain that by saying that there's some advanced aging mutation, something that caused the bone to age anomalously quickly. A gene that's known to be associated with progeria, that also no changes there. So the next problem, of course, is the ribs and the number of ribs in the specimen. Only 10, whereas there's supposed to be 12. So there are no mutations which are specifically associated with that kind of phenomena because it's rarely, if ever, seen. The digits are all correct. The hands are all correct. There are problems with the face. So there's a mid-face hypoplasia, and then there's the larger skull. So again, I think in summary, there are genes associated with any one or two of the anomalies that we see in the specimen, but there is no mutation which is known to accommodate or call for all of the mutations. Even with the things that we know could be assigned to one or more of the anomalies, we don't find them in the genetics of this specimen. That leaves open the question, what genetics is causing the anomalies that we are observing? So although I entered this thinking DNA was the answer, it made me realize that in the context of the bigger biology questions, there are other levels of control that need to be understood and answered. The non-coding RNA, epigenetics, etc. And things that we probably haven't even thought of yet. So if I just look at, this is base pair 19,800,000 or so at this edge of the open region. I can go all the way over here, and now I'm at 21,000 or 22,000. So the answer is not finished, and it's not as easy as actually, frankly, I thought it was going to be at the beginning. So that's basically 2 million base pairs of DNA where nothing seems to sit. It's just like the way societies do things. They try to fit things in boxes. We have literally written a computer program that does exactly that, tries to fit it in the box. Doesn't seem very efficient, so on that basis, people would call it junk. But I think we now know that there's any of a number of other features of what DNA is doing in there. It is expressed. And so we need to be careful, obviously, that we don't let our instincts or the programs that we write to match our instincts make the decisions for us. No matter what, for me, this has been a fascinating, more than an exercise. As soon as I've collated this information into a form that other people can take advantage of, and it's accepted for publication, I'm just going to put it out on the web. You know, I don't have the resources to study and follow down every single angle that this opens up. But, you know, maybe there is a listener out there who will be sufficiently intrigued by this to do the analyses themselves, and maybe they'll find something that I missed. Great. If additional samples or examples are seen of this, I'll be the first in line to want to sequence it, because then all bets are off. I want to say other things here, but I also don't want to open myself up for, you know, attack.
This search may have uncovered a major finding about life in the universe and its origins. What is this being? Could it be a missing link in evolution? Could it be an entirely new species? Or simply a disease we have never seen before? Or could this be an extraterrestrial being from another world? Whatever the case may be, this challenges the boundaries of human scientific knowledge. Dr. Gary Nolan has set a new precedent for scientific investigation and rigor in the realm of the seemingly impossible.
Now, we have now over 4,000 cases of extraterrestrial vehicles that have landed, 3,500 pilot cases, over 5,000 documents from the US government, and hundreds of thousands of pages of documents from 14 countries that have opened their files since the Disclosure Project was launched 11 years ago. And yet, this isn't on CNN every night.
And this is probably the most important thing going on this planet today, and yet nobody talks about it.
If we don't explore what to do, we're going to miss the boat.
And that could be why Eisenhower's final message wasn't just doom and gloom. It was a charge to the people to spit out the bread, look away from the circus, and take some responsibility.
Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
The dam is in fact breaking, and you're beginning to see countries all over the world begin to come forward with what they know to be absolute fact.
Since 2001, 24 countries have opened their UFO files to the public, including Australia, the UK, Vatican City, Germany, Russia, and Canada. The United States is not yet among them.
What we have to do is pave the way for these leaders. Because if the people will lead, the leaders will follow. They'll have to. And it isn't about overthrowing the Pentagon, it's about leaving it behind. My goal when I started this was to make this so that I wasn't important at all in it, that there would be enough people that they go on without me. And that way, it doesn't matter if I drop dead. The future is here already. The technologies are here, contact is happening. And if we come together as a people, what we're going to find is that all of us working together are going to be able to create a world that is amazing. If every single one of us told everyone we know that we're being visited by intelligent life, that the sciences are here to give us a new civilization, we're liberated from that macroeconomic slavery, but this is the destiny of humanity. Thank you very much. God bless you all. Thank you.
What we've come to learn is this. We are standing at the precipice of a new age. There is power in the many, but only when they're acting as one. That's when resonance happens. Whether joining together as a responsible citizenry against the forces standing to divide us, or joining consciousness to unite with the beings who are prepared to communicate with us. In order to succeed in this endeavor called life, we must come together as one.
Koşaya